Sometimes, the most unlikely friendships are forged in the crucible of survival. In the harsh Nevada territory of 1880, a dying cowboy named Jack Roughneck Dalton discovers that kindness given years ago can return in the most unexpected form. Jack has always been a loner, scarred by a brutal past, and known throughout the territory for his quick draw and quicker temper. When a gunfight with outlaws leaves him wounded and dying in his remote cabin, he expects to face death alone. But nature has other plans. A magnificent black panther appears at his doorstep, the same creature Jack saved as a cub years before when its mother was killed by hunters. Now grown and powerful, the panther has returned to repay an old debt. What follows is a story that defies everything the frontier towns thought they knew about both man and beast. But can a wild animal truly understand loyalty? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind whistled through the pines surrounding Jack Dalton's cabin, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another harsh Nevada winter. Jack sat hunched over his worn wooden table, the flickering light of a kerosene lamp casting long shadows across his weathered face. His calloused fingers traced the pages of a leather journal, its edges soft and rounded from years of handling. Inside, sketched in rough but careful lines, were drawings of animals, wolves, eagles, and on one particular page that drew his attention tonight, a small, black panther cub. The sketch was crude, but detailed enough to capture the cub's distinctive markings, the white patch behind its left ear, the slight bend in its tail where it had been caught in a trap. Jack's handwriting, usually bold and decisive, seemed almost tender in the note scrawled beside the drawing. Found near Willow Creek, mother killed by Hendricks and his hunting party. Cub, half-starved, fed him jerky and creek water, stayed 3 days before he was strong enough to hunt mice. Jack closed the journal and set it aside, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his right side. The bullet wound from yesterday's encounter with the Brennan gang was deeper than he'd initially thought. He'd managed to patch himself up well enough to make it back to the cabin, but the blood seeping through his makeshift bandage told him what he already knew. This was the end of the trail for Jack Roughneck Dalton. At 53, Jack had lived longer than most men in his profession. He'd been a lawman, a bounty hunter, and when circumstances demanded it, a gunfighter who settled disputes with lead rather than words. His reputation stretched from the Colorado mining camps to the California coast. Men feared him, women avoided him, and children crossed the street when they saw him coming. It was exactly the life he'd chosen after the war, when he'd returned from fighting for the Union to find his family farm burned and his parents dead. The isolation suited him. His cabin sat 15 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Ridge, accessible only by a winding trail that most folks found too treacherous to navigate. Jack preferred it that way. Out here, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and his own thoughts, he could forget about the 27 men he'd killed in fair fights, the countless others he'd brought in dead rather than alive, and the reputation that followed him like a shadow. But tonight, as he sat dying in the same chair where he'd spent countless evenings cleaning his guns and planning his next job, Jack found himself thinking not about the violence that had defined his life, but about the small acts of kindness he'd tried to forget. Like the panther cub, it had been 7 years since that day near Willow Creek. Jack had been tracking a horse thief when he'd heard the pitiful mewing coming from a thicket of brambles. He'd almost ridden past, after all, what was one more orphaned animal in a wilderness full of them. But something about the sound had stopped him. Maybe it was the way the cub's cries reminded him of his own loneliness, or perhaps it was simply that he'd grown tired of seeing death everywhere he went. The cub had been barely alive when Jack found it, its ribs showing through its dull black coat, its golden eyes dulled by hunger and fear. Jack had dismounted and carefully extracted the small creature from the thorns, noting the fresh wounds on its hindquarters where scavengers had tried to make a meal of it. For 3 days, he'd stayed in that makeshift camp, feeding the cub bits of jerky and drops of water from his canteen, watching as strength slowly returned to its tiny body. On the morning of the 4th day, the cub had caught its first mouse. Jack had watched with something approaching pride as the young panther stalked the small rodent with instinctive grace, pouncing with surprising accuracy for such a weak creature. That afternoon, Jack had packed his gear and ridden away, but not before sketching the cub in his journal and writing a brief account of their encounter. He'd told himself it was just a practical decision. 3 days was long enough to ensure the animal's survival, and he had a job to finish. But if he was being honest, and dying men had little reason for dishonesty, he'd grown attached to the small creature. There had been something in its golden eyes, a spark of intelligence and gratitude that had touched something deep inside Jack's guarded heart. Now, as he sat bleeding in his cabin, Jack wondered what had become of that cub. 7 years was a lifetime in the wild. The young panther had probably grown into a magnificent hunter, roaming the mountain valleys and living the kind of free life that Jack himself had never known. Or perhaps it had fallen prey to hunters like the ones who had killed its mother, ending up as a trophy on some rich man's wall. Jack reached for the bottle of whiskey on the table, pouring himself a generous measure. The alcohol burned as it went down, but it helped dull the constant ache in his side. He'd been shot before more times than he cared to count, but this time felt different. This time, the bullet had found something vital, and no amount of frontier doctoring was going to fix it. The Brennan gang had been planning to rob the bank in Cedar Ridge when Jack had gotten word of their intentions. As the town's unofficial protector, a role he'd fallen into more by circumstance than choice, Jack had ridden out to intercept them at Devil's Canyon. The fight had been brief, but vicious. 3 of the outlaws lay dead in the canyon, but their leader, Cole Brennan, had managed to put a bullet in Jack's gut before Jack's return shot had sent him tumbling off his horse. Jack had considered riding into town to see Doc Henderson, but he knew what the old physician would tell him. The bullet was too deep to remove safely, and even if it could be extracted, infection would likely set in. Better to die in his own place, surrounded by the wilderness he'd come to love, than in some sterile room in town with people he barely knew, offering false comfort. A sudden sound outside made Jack reach instinctively for his Colt .45. Years of living on the edge had honed his hearing to a razor's sharpness, and what he'd heard was definitely not the wind. Something large was moving through the underbrush near his cabin, something that moved with the calculated stealth of a predator. Jack stood slowly, fighting off a wave of dizziness, and made his way to the window. The moon was nearly full, casting the clearing around his cabin in silver light. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the pine trees and the old corral where he kept his horse. Then, emerging from the tree line like a ghost made flesh, came a sight that made Jack question whether the blood loss was making him hallucinate. A black panther, massive and muscular, stepped into the moonlight. Its coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and its golden eyes reflected the lamplight from Jack's window. But what stopped Jack's breath was the distinctive white patch behind the animal's left ear and the slight bend in its tail marks that could belong to only one creature. The panther approached the cabin with measured steps, its powerful haunches bunching and releasing with each fluid movement. When it reached the porch, it sat back on its hindquarters and looked directly at the window, where Jack stood, transfixed. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other across the years and the vastness of their different worlds. Then, impossibly, the panther let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl of threat, but something that sounded almost like recognition. Jack felt tears sting his eyes, something that hadn't happened since the day he'd buried his parents. The cub had remembered. After 7 years of surviving in the harsh wilderness, growing into this magnificent creature, it had somehow found its way back to the man who had saved its life. Jack opened the cabin door slowly, his gun still in his hand but pointed at the ground. The panther's ears twitched at the sound, but it made no move to flee. Instead, it rose to its feet and padded closer, its massive paws making no sound on the wooden porch. When it was close enough to touch, the panther extended its head toward Jack, just as the cub had done all those years ago when it had first accepted food from his hand. With trembling fingers, Jack reached out and touched the soft fur behind the panther's ear, right where the white patch marked it as surely as any brand. The animal leaned into his touch, purring with a sound like distant thunder. Jack felt something break inside his chest, not physically, but emotionally. All the walls he'd built around his heart, all the barriers he'd erected to keep the world at bay, crumbled in that moment. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You came back, didn't you, boy?" The panther's purr grew louder, and Jack could have sworn he saw understanding in those golden eyes. "I'm dying, you know," he continued, talking to the animal as if it were an old friend. "Got myself shot up pretty good this time, but I reckon dying ain't so bad if you don't have to do it alone." The panther settled down on the porch, its massive body blocking the doorway like a sentinel. Jack eased himself back into his chair, leaving the door open so he could see his unexpected visitor. The night air was cold, but the sight of the panther filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. As the hours passed and the moon tracked across the sky, Jack found himself talking to the panther about things he'd never shared with another living soul. He spoke of the war and the things he'd seen, of the loneliness that had driven him to this remote cabin, of the men he'd killed and the ones he'd failed to save. The panther listened with the patience of a confessor, its golden eyes never leaving Jack's face. When dawn began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, Jack realized that for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't afraid. Death was coming. He could feel it in the growing weakness of his limbs and the increasing difficulty of each breath, but he wasn't facing it alone. The cub he'd saved had grown into a creature of incredible beauty and power, and somehow it had come home to repay a kindness shown by a man who had forgotten he was capable of kindness. As the first rays of sunlight touched the cabin's weathered walls, Jack closed his eyes and smiled. Whatever happened next, he knew that his last act wouldn't be one of violence or cruelty, but of connection. The panther had reminded him of who he'd been before the war, before the killing, before he'd convinced himself that he was nothing more than a gun for hire with a talent for death. The leather journal lay open on the table, the sketch of the panther cub visible in the growing light. Beside it, Jack's dying words would soon be whispered into the mountain air, words of gratitude and wonder at the mysterious ways that kindness could return to a man when he needed it most. The confrontation at Devil's Canyon had begun like so many others in Jack's career, with intelligence, planning, and the cold certainty that violence was inevitable. Word had reached him through Billy Garrett, the young telegraph operator in Cedar Ridge, that the Brennan gang was riding hard toward town with robbery on their minds. The Cedar Ridge Bank held the payroll for 3 mining operations, making it a tempting target for men who preferred taking money to earning it. Jack had ridden out before dawn, his horse's hooves echoing against the canyon walls as he took the shortcut through Devil's Canyon. He knew Cole Brennan's reputation. The man was smart enough to scout his targets and vicious enough to kill anyone who stood in his way. The canyon offered the perfect ambush point, a narrow passage where even skilled riders would be forced to slow their pace. Jack had positioned himself behind a cluster of red rocks that jutted from the canyon floor like the broken teeth of some ancient giant. His Winchester rifle was loaded and ready, his Colt .45 checked and holstered within easy reach. He'd done this dance so many times before that his hands moved with automatic precision, checking his weapons and ammunition with the methodical care of a man who understood that small mistakes led to large consequences. The Brennan gang had come through the canyon just as Jack expected, 4 men riding hard with their faces set toward the promise of easy money. Jack had recognized Cole Brennan, immediately tall and lean, with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in Tombstone. The other three were typical hired guns, men whose names Jack didn't know, but whose type he'd encountered countless times. "Cole Brennan," Jack had called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is as far as you ride. Turn around and head back where you came from, and we can all ride away from this." Brennan had reined in his horse, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Jack Dalton," he'd replied, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and hatred. "Should have known they'd send their pet killer to deal with us. You cost me a lot of money when you brought in my brother last year. Your brother cost himself when he decided robbing stages was easier than honest work." Jack had responded, rising from behind his rocky cover. "He's doing 5 years in territorial prison, which is better than what he deserved. You can join him, or you can die here in this canyon. Your choice." The negotiation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Brennan was too proud to back down, and his men were too committed to the planned robbery to consider retreat. When Brennan's hand dropped toward his gun, Jack had already begun his draw, the Colt clearing leather with the smooth speed that had kept him alive through a dozen similar encounters. The gunfight had been brief but devastating. Jack's first shot took down Brennan's lieutenant, a man named Rawlings who'd been wanted for murder in 3 territories. His second shot shattered the wrist of another outlaw, sending the man's weapon spinning into the dust. The third man, seeing his companions fall, had tried to wheel his horse around and flee, but Jack's Winchester had ended his escape before it began. That left Cole Brennan, and the outlaw leader had proven why his reputation was so fearsome. Even as Jack's bullets were finding their marks, Brennan had managed to draw and fire, his shot coming so close to Jack's that the report seemed to echo as one. Jack felt the bullet tear through his shirt and punch into his side just below his ribs, but his return shot was already traveling toward its target. Brennan's horse had reared as the outlaw leader tumbled from his saddle, clutching his chest where Jack's bullet had found its home. The animal had wheeled and galloped away, leaving its rider sprawled in the canyon dust, with blood spreading across his shirt front. Jack had approached cautiously, his gun still drawn, but Brennan's glassy eyes told him the fight was over. "Should have taken the prison time," Jack had muttered, pressing his hand against his own wound and feeling the warm stickiness of blood seeping between his fingers. The bullet had gone deep, and Jack's experienced assessment told him this was no graze to be shrugged off. This was the kind of wound that required immediate medical attention, the kind he wasn't going to get 15 miles from the nearest doctor. The ride back to his cabin had been a nightmare of pain and determination. Jack had bound his wound as best he could, with strips torn from his shirt, but the blood kept seeping through the makeshift bandage. His horse, sensing his distress, had picked its way carefully along the mountain trail, but every jolt and bump sent fresh waves of agony through Jack's midsection. By the time he'd reached his cabin, Jack knew with the grim certainty of a man who'd seen death many times that this wound was going to kill him. The bullet had probably nicked something vital, a blood vessel or an organ that was slowly bleeding internally. He could feel his strength ebbing with each passing hour, his vision occasionally blurring at the edges in a way that spoke of significant blood loss. Jack had managed to stable his horse and drag himself into the cabin before his legs gave out completely. He'd collapsed into his chair, his bloodied bandana pressed against his side, and faced the reality that Jack Roughneck, Dalton's long and violent career, was finally coming to an end. There was no one to ride for help, no miracle cure waiting in his medicine chest, no last-minute rescue that would snatch him from death's embrace. The irony wasn't lost on him. After all the bullets he'd dodged, all the knives he'd avoided, all the desperate men he'd faced down in dusty streets and shadowed alleys, it was going to be a single shot from a dying outlaw that finally claimed him. Jack had actually managed a bitter laugh at the thought, though the motion sent fresh spears of pain through his wounded side. As the night had deepened and the pain had grown worse, Jack had prepared himself for a solitary death. He'd written no letters, there was no one left who would care to read them. He'd made no final confessions. His sins were his own to carry into whatever came after this life. He'd simply sat in his chair, sipping whiskey to dull the pain, and waited for the end to come. Then the panther had arrived. Jack had heard it first, the soft padding of enormous paws on the forest floor, the almost silent movement of a creature that had learned to hunt in absolute quiet. His hand had moved automatically to his gun, but something in the quality of the sound had given him pause. This wasn't the hurried movement of a predator stalking prey, but the deliberate approach of an animal with a specific purpose. When the magnificent black cat had stepped into the moonlight, Jack had felt his world shift on its axis. The white patch behind its ear, the distinctive bend in its tail, these were marks he remembered as clearly as his own scars. The small, helpless cub he'd rescued near Willow Creek had grown into this powerful, beautiful creature, and somehow, impossibly, it had found its way back to him. The recognition had been mutual and immediate. The panther's golden eyes had locked onto Jack's face with an intelligence that transcended the usual barriers between human and animal. There had been no fear in that gaze, no wild wariness that might be expected from a creature encountering a human. Instead, there had been something that looked remarkably like concern, as if the panther somehow understood that the man who had once saved its life was now in mortal danger. Jack had opened his cabin door with trembling hands, his wound forgotten in the wonder of the moment. The panther had approached without hesitation, its massive head lowering to accept Jack's touch with the same trust it had shown as a cub. The soft rumble of its purr had filled the night air, a sound of contentment and recognition that had brought tears to Jack's eyes. "You remember, don't you?" Jack had whispered, his fingers stroking the familiar white patch behind the panther's ear. "After all these years, you still remember." The panther had settled itself on Jack's porch like a guardian, its powerful body positioned between the dying man and the wilderness beyond. Its presence had transformed everything. What had begun as a lonely vigil in the face of death had become something else entirely. Jack was no longer dying alone in a remote cabin. He was being attended by a creature whose very existence spoke to the mysterious connections that could bind lives together across time and species. As dawn had approached, Jack had found himself talking to the panther as if it were an old friend returned from a long journey. He'd told it about the years that had passed since their first meeting, about the loneliness that had driven him deeper into the wilderness, about the violence that had defined his life, and the growing weariness that had made him long for something different. The panther had listened with the patience of a confessor, its golden eyes never leaving Jack's face. There had been no judgment in that gaze, no condemnation for the blood on Jack's hands or the hard choices he'd made. There had been only acceptance and a loyalty that humbled the dying gunfighter. The bloodied bandana that served as Jack's makeshift bandage had become more than just a piece of cloth. It had become a symbol of his mortality, a tangible reminder that even the fastest gun in the Nevada territory was still flesh and blood. But in the panther's presence, that symbol had taken on a different meaning. It had become a bridge between past and present, between the man who had shown kindness to a helpless cub and the creature who had returned to offer comfort to a dying friend. As the first light of dawn had touched the cabin walls, Jack had understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The panther's return wasn't just coincidence or the random movement of a wild animal. It was something deeper, a connection forged in compassion and strengthened by time. The cub he'd saved had become his salvation, not from death, but from the fear and loneliness that had threatened to make his final hours unbearable. The bloodied bandana pressed against his wound reminded Jack that his time was limited, but the panther's presence promised that his remaining hours would not be empty of meaning. Death was still coming, but it would find Jack Dalton surrounded by love, a love that transcended species and spoke to the fundamental connections that bind all living things together. The fresh rabbit carcass lay on Jack's weathered porch like an offering from another world, its warm blood still steaming in the cool mountain air. Jack stared at the lifeless animal through eyes dulled by pain and morphine, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The panther sat beside its gift, with the patient dignity of a hunter presenting prey to a respected elder, its golden eyes fixed on Jack's face with an expression that could only be described as expectant. In all his years on the frontier, Jack had witnessed countless examples of animal behavior, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of recognition. The panther had not only returned to him after 7 years, but it was actively providing for his survival, hunting fresh game and delivering it with the same care he had once shown when feeding the starving cub at Willow Creek. "You brought this for me," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse with wonder and weakness. "You actually went out and hunted this rabbit for me." The panther's response was a low rumble of satisfaction, a sound that seemed to confirm Jack's understanding. The great cat rose from its position and approached the cabin entrance, its massive head lowering to nuzzle gently against Jack's trembling hand. The gesture was unmistakably one of care, a tender encouragement for the wounded man to accept the gift that had been provided with such devotion. Jack's hands shook as he retrieved the rabbit and carried it into his cabin. The panther followed, settling itself in the corner where it could observe every movement. The simple act of preparing fresh meat provided a welcome distraction from his pain, and for the first time since the shooting, Jack felt his appetite returning. The prospect of protein from a recent kill gave his failing body a small surge of hope. As Jack worked to skin and clean the rabbit, he found himself talking to the panther with the natural ease of someone addressing an old friend. "You know, in all my years out here, I never imagined I'd have a hunting partner quite like you," he said, carefully cutting the meat into manageable portions. "Most folks would say you're just following instinct, but there's something in your eyes that tells me different." The panther's ears twitched at the sound of Jack's voice, and its gaze tracked every movement as he prepared their shared meal. There was an alertness in the animal's posture that spoke of genuine concern, as if the great cat were monitoring Jack's condition and finding it worthy of continued worry. When the meat was ready, cooked over the coals of Jack's fireplace, it proved to be exactly what his weakened system needed. The fresh protein gave him a measure of strength he hadn't felt since the bullet had torn through his side. For the first time since Cole Brennan's shot had found its mark, Jack could think clearly rather than existing in the fog of pain and approaching death. It was mid-morning when the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced their first visitor. Jack heard the horse long before the rider came into view, and the panther's reaction was immediate and protective. The great cat rose to its feet, positioning itself between the cabin and the approaching stranger, every muscle in its powerful frame coiled with readiness. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, reaching out to touch the panther's flank. "Let's see who's come calling before we decide if they're friend or foe." The rider who emerged from the forest trail was Dr. James Henderson, Cedar Ridge's traveling physician and one of the few men in the territory Jack genuinely trusted. The doctor's weathered face showed deep concern, and his medical bag hung from his saddle with the weight of urgent purpose. Dr. Henderson reined in his horse abruptly when he spotted the panther, his eyes widening with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The great cat stood motionless but alert, its golden eyes fixed on the newcomer, with the calm assessment of a predator evaluating potential threat. "Jack!" Dr. Henderson called out, his voice tight with worry. "What in God's name is that creature doing here? Are you injured?" "I'm dying, Doc," Jack replied with his characteristic directness. "But I'm not alone anymore. This old friend of mine won't hurt you, will you, boy?" Jack's hand rested gently on the panther's massive shoulder, and at his words, the tension in the animal's frame seemed to ease slightly. The panther didn't retreat, but it shifted its stance to allow the doctor to approach while maintaining its protective position. "Doctor." Henderson dismounted with careful, deliberate movements, his eyes never leaving the magnificent predator that had claimed guardianship over his patient. "Billy Garrett sent word about the shooting at Devil's Canyon, Doctor." Henderson explained, tying his horse to Jack's hitching post with hands that trembled slightly. Said you went after the Brennan gang alone. I came as soon as I could get away from my other patients. Cole, Brennan and his boys are all dead. Jack reported matter-of-factly, but Cole managed to put a bullet in me before I finished him. It's lodged deep, Doc. We both know what that means. Dr. Henderson approached the cabin with the measured steps of a man who understood he was entering the territory of an apex predator. The Panther watched his every movement but made no aggressive gestures, seeming to recognize that this human posed no threat to the wounded man it was protecting. When the doctor reached the porch steps, the Panther moved aside to allow him passage, but remained close enough to intervene if necessary. Dr. Henderson paused to stare at the magnificent creature, slowly shaking his head in amazement. In 30 years of practicing medicine on the frontier, he said quietly, I've seen many strange things, but nothing quite like this. That animal is actually guarding you, Jack, protecting you like a devoted companion. He brought me breakfast this morning, Jack said, nodding toward the remains of the rabbit. Hunted it fresh and laid it right here on my porch like an offering. You ever hear tell of such a thing, Doc? Dr. Henderson set his medical bag on the porch and began removing instruments and supplies, his movements careful and professional, despite his continued amazement at the Panther's presence. I've heard old-timers tell stories about such bonds between man and beast, he admitted. But I always figured they were tall tales told around campfires to pass the time. Seeing it with my own eyes is something else entirely. The examination that followed was thorough but gentle, Dr. Henderson's experienced hands probing Jack's wound with the practiced care of someone who understood they were dealing with a mortal injury. Throughout the process, the Panther watched intently, its ears flattening whenever Jack winced in pain, its golden eyes tracking every movement the doctor made. The bullet's lodged against your spine, Dr. Henderson said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of delivering fatal news. I could attempt to remove it, but the operation would likely kill you faster than the wound itself. Even if you survived the surgery, there's no guarantee you'd ever walk again. Jack nodded, having expected such a diagnosis. How much time do I have, Doc? Days, maybe a week if you're fortunate. The internal bleeding is slow but steady. You'll grow weaker gradually, then more rapidly as your body begins to shut down. The doctor's professional demeanor couldn't entirely hide the sorrow in his eyes. Jack might be a hard man with a violent past, but he was also one of the few people in the territory who could be counted on when decent folks needed protection. I can provide something for the pain, Dr. Henderson continued, preparing a dose of morphine, and I'll leave supplies to keep the wound clean. But Jack. He paused, glancing meaningfully at the Panther. You shouldn't remain alone out here. That's a wild animal, regardless of how tame it appears right now. As you grow weaker, there's no telling how it might react. Jack followed the doctor's gaze to the Panther, which had settled into a relaxed position while remaining alert to everything happening around it. He's not tame, Doc. He's loyal. There's an important difference. Jack's voice carried a certainty born of growing understanding. 7 years ago, I saved his life when he was nothing but a starving cub. Now he's returned that favor by ensuring I don't have to die alone. As Dr. Henderson administered the morphine injection, the Panther observed the procedure with keen interest, its massive head tilted as if trying to understand the strange ritual being performed on its wounded friend. The pain relief was immediate and welcome, allowing Jack to think more clearly than he had since the shooting. I'll stop by the telegraph office on my way back to town, Dr. Henderson said as he packed his instruments. Is there anyone you'd like me to contact? Any family who should be informed? Jack considered the question carefully. My sister Sarah lives in St. Louis. We haven't spoken in years, but I reckon she'd want to know. Tell her. He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gulf of time and bitter silence that had separated them. Tell her I'm sorry for the harsh words that passed between us, and that I never stopped thinking of her as family. As Dr. Henderson prepared to depart, The panther rose and approached his horse with calm curiosity. The animal snorted nervously at the predator's scent, but the panther made no threatening moves, instead seeming to investigate this visitor who had come to help its wounded companion. "That's the most remarkable animal I've ever encountered, Doctor," Henderson said as he mounted his horse. "The intelligence in those eyes is extraordinary. It's almost as if it understands not just that you're injured, but that you're dying." "Maybe that's exactly what it understands, Doc," Jack replied thoughtfully. "Maybe this old panther is teaching us something about loyalty and friendship that we thought we already knew, but really didn't." After the doctor's departure, Jack found himself alone with the panther once again, but the dynamic between them had subtly changed. The morphine had dulled his pain to manageable levels, and for the first time since the shooting, he could contemplate his situation with something approaching clarity. The fresh rabbit carcass, cleaned and prepared, represented far more than simple sustenance. It was tangible proof of a bond that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal, evidence of loyalty that had survived 7 years of separation and countless dangers. The panther had not only remembered the man who had saved its life, but it had taken on the role of provider and protector with a devotion that humbled the dying gunfighter. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, Jack watched the panther with growing appreciation for the intelligence behind those golden eyes. The animal seemed to understand not just that he was gravely ill, but that his condition was worsening. It positioned itself where it could monitor his breathing and movement while maintaining its protective watch over the cabin's approaches. The transformation in Jack's understanding of his own situation was profound. What had begun as a solitary death vigil had become something else entirely, a final chapter in an unlikely friendship that spoke to the mysterious connections binding all living things together. The fresh rabbit carcass had been more than food. It had been a declaration of loyalty that would sustain Jack's spirit, even as his body failed. When evening shadows began to lengthen across the clearing, Jack reflected on the day's revelations. The panther's return wasn't just a remarkable coincidence, it was the fulfillment of a bond forged in compassion and strengthened by the passage of time. The cub he had saved at Willow Creek had become his salvation, not from death itself, but from the fear and loneliness that had threatened to make his final hours unbearable. The fresh rabbit carcass, still warm from the hunt, had become a symbol of the reversal that had taken place between them. Where once Jack had provided for a helpless creature, now that same animal had grown into a magnificent predator capable of providing for him in his hour of greatest need. The circle of care and protection had come full turn, creating a bond that would define both their lives until the very end. The telegraph had done its work with remarkable efficiency. 3 days after Dr. Henderson's visit, Jack heard the familiar sound of a wagon approaching his cabin, its wheels crunching over the rocky trail that led to his remote homestead. The panther, which had maintained its protective vigil with unwavering dedication, immediately rose to investigate the newcomer. Through the cabin window, Jack watched as a hired wagon from Cedar Ridge came into view, driven by Tom Morrison, the town's livery stable owner. Beside him sat a woman Jack hadn't seen in over 15 years, his sister Sarah, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, but her green eyes as sharp and determined as he remembered. The panther's reaction to Sarah's arrival was markedly different from its response to Dr. Henderson. Where it had shown cautious acceptance of the doctor, the great cat seemed to sense something significant about this new visitor. It approached the wagon with measured steps, its golden eyes fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that made even Tom Morrison nervous enough to reach for the rifle beside his seat. "Easy there, Tom," Jack called from his doorway, his voice weak but carrying enough authority to stay the livery owner's hand. "He's not going to hurt anyone. Sarah, it's good to see you, sister." Sarah Dalton had never been one to show weakness, even as a child, but Jack could see the shock in her eyes as she took in his gaunt appearance and the enormous predator that stood between them. She climbed down from the wagon with the careful dignity of a woman who had learned to face life's surprises with composure. Her traveling dress practical and well-made, despite the long journey from Missouri. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice carrying the same directness that had always characterized their family. "Dr. Henderson's telegram said you were dying. I came as soon as I could arrange passage." Her eyes never left the Panther, which had positioned itself where it could observe both siblings without appearing threatening. "I appreciate you making the journey," Jack replied, steadying himself against the doorframe. "Though I have to say, you've got more courage than most folks, walking up to a cabin guarded by a Panther." Tom Morrison remained on the wagon seat, clearly uncomfortable with the proximity of the large predator. "Miss Dalton, are you sure about this? That's a dangerous animal, and if something happens to you out here—" "Mr. Morrison," Sarah interrupted with the tone of a woman accustomed to having her decisions respected, "my brother has survived 15 years in this wilderness. I trust his judgment about the safety of his companion." She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a carefully wrapped bundle. "This was our grandmother's shawl. I thought you might want to have it." The shawl was a masterwork of knitting, its intricate pattern speaking of countless hours spent by firelight during long winter evenings. Sarah had kept it all these years, through her marriage, her husband's death, and her subsequent life as a widow, managing her own affairs in St. Louis. That she had brought it across half the continent spoke to the depth of feeling that had prompted her journey. As Sarah approached the cabin, the Panther stepped aside but didn't retreat. Instead, it watched her with what could only be described as curiosity, its massive head tilting as if trying to understand the relationship between these two humans. When Sarah was close enough to touch, the Panther did something that astonished even Jack. It lowered its head in a gesture that seemed almost respectful. "My word," Sarah breathed, her composure finally cracking slightly. "It's beautiful. And those eyes. There's intelligence there, isn't there? Real intelligence." "More than most people would credit," Jack agreed, accepting the shawl with hands that trembled slightly from weakness. The soft wool carried the faint scent of lavender, a reminder of the home they'd shared before the war changed everything. "He saved my life," Sarah. "Brought me food when I was too weak to hunt, stood guard while I slept. If that's not intelligence, I don't know what is." Tom Morrison completed his delivery of supplies and departed with obvious relief, leaving the siblings alone with their four-legged guardian. Sarah had brought food from town, fresh bread, preserved fruits, and medicines that Dr. Henderson had requested. But Jack found himself more interested in simply talking with the sister he'd thought he might never see again. They sat on the porch as the afternoon sun painted the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The Panther had settled nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to give them privacy. Its presence had become so natural that Jack found it hard to remember what the cabin had felt like, without the great cat's protective shadow. "Tell me about this Panther," Sarah said, her voice soft with genuine curiosity. Dr. Henderson mentioned in his telegram that there was more to the story than just a wild animal taking shelter. Jack told her about finding the cub at Willow Creek, about the 3 days he'd spent nursing it back to health, and about the impossible recognition that had occurred when the fully grown Panther had appeared at his cabin. Sarah listened with the focused attention she'd always given to his stories, but her questions revealed a mind trying to understand something that defied conventional wisdom. "You're telling me this animal remembered you after 7 years?" she asked, reaching slowly toward the Panther. To Jack's amazement, the great cat allowed her touch, its golden eyes closing briefly as she stroked the soft fur behind its ear. "And it somehow knew you were in trouble?" "I can't explain it any better than you can," Jack admitted. "All I know is that I was prepared to die alone, and instead, I've spent the last few days with the most loyal companion I've ever known. Whether that's instinct, intelligence, or something else entirely, I'm grateful for it." As evening approached, more visitors began to arrive. Word had spread through Cedar Ridge and the surrounding settlements that Jack Dalton, the feared gunfighter who'd kept the peace for over a decade, was dying, and that he was being attended by a panther. The curious and the concerned came in equal measure, drawn by a story that seemed to belong more to legend than to the harsh reality of frontier life. Billy Garrett, the telegraph operator, arrived with his wife Martha and their 2 young children. They kept their distance at first, awed by the sight of the massive predator that lay peacefully beside Jack's chair. But as the evening progressed and the panther showed no signs of aggression, even the children began to lose their fear. "Mr. Dalton," young Timothy Garrett asked with the directness of childhood, "is that panther really your friend?" Jack smiled, one of the first genuine smiles Sarah had seen from him since her arrival. "He's the best friend an old cowboy could ask for, son. Loyal, brave, and never asks for anything more than a kind word and a gentle touch." The panther seemed to understand it was being discussed, lifting its massive head to regard the boy with calm interest. Timothy, emboldened by the animal's peaceful demeanor, took a step closer. "Can I pet him?" the boy asked, his voice filled with wonder. Jack looked at the panther, which had remained perfectly still during the child's approach. "That's up to him, Timothy, but if he lets you touch him, be gentle. He's wild, not tame, and we need to respect that." To everyone's amazement, the panther lowered its head when Timothy extended his hand, allowing the boy to stroke its fur with the careful touch of someone handling something precious. The great cat's purr rumbled through the evening air, a sound of contentment that seemed to bridge the gap between the civilized world and the wilderness that surrounded them. As more people arrived throughout the evening, ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, and their families, a sense of community began to form around Jack's cabin. These were people who had known him primarily as a dangerous man to be feared and respected, but the sight of him cared for by a wild panther seemed to reveal a different side of his character. Sarah watched the interactions with growing understanding. Her brother had always been a complicated man, capable of both violence and tenderness, but the harsh realities of frontier life had emphasized the former while hiding the latter. The panther's presence seemed to have unlocked something in Jack that had been buried for years, a capacity for connection that went beyond the mutual benefit of protection and payment. "He's not the same man who left Missouri all those years ago," she told Martha Garrett as they watched Jack sharing stories with the gathered visitors. "The war changed him, made him hard, but this animal has reminded him of who he used to be." Martha nodded, her eyes on the panther that lay peacefully beside Jack's chair. "My husband says Mr. Dalton saved this town more times than anyone can count. Drove off rustlers, faced down claim jumpers, kept the peace when things could have turned ugly. Maybe the panther knows that. Maybe animals understand things about a person's character that we miss." As the evening wore on, Jack found himself at the center of something he'd never experienced, a gathering of people who genuinely cared about his well-being. The panther's presence had somehow transformed him from a feared gunfighter into something else entirely, a man worth saving, worth visiting, worth mourning when he was gone. The hand-knitted shawl lay across Jack's lap, its intricate patterns catching the light from the lanterns that had been brought to illuminate the gathering. Sarah had made it herself during the long winter evenings after her husband's death, her fingers working the wool while her mind wandered to the brother she'd lost to violence and distance. That she had brought it to him now, in his final days, spoke to the power of family bonds that even years of silence couldn't completely sever. When the last visitor had departed and Sarah had settled into the spare room Jack had hastily prepared, the panther resumed its position as guardian. But something had changed in its behavior, where before it had been protective primarily of Jack. Now, it seemed to extend that protection to Sarah as well, as if understanding that she too was family, and therefore worthy of its care. "Thank you," Jack whispered to the great cat as he prepared for what might be his last night, "for bringing me food, for bringing me company, and for bringing me back to my sister. I don't know how you knew what I needed, but somehow you did." The panther's response was a gentle rumble that seemed to say such gratitude wasn't necessary, that loyalty, once given, required no thanks and expected no reward. As Jack drifted off to sleep with his grandmother's shawl wrapped around his shoulders, he reflected on the mysterious ways that kindness could return to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The cub he'd saved had grown into more than just a magnificent predator. It had become a bridge between worlds, a living symbol of the connections that bind all creatures together in the great web of existence. Young Timothy Garrett had returned to the cabin before dawn, his small figure emerging from the forest mist like a determined spirit. The boy had convinced his parents to let him visit again by promising to help with chores and behave himself. But Jack suspected the real negotiation had involved Martha Garrett's own curiosity about the remarkable situation unfolding at the remote homestead. The panther had sensed Timothy's approach long before the boy became visible, its ears pricking forward with interest rather than alarm. There was something about children that the great cat seemed to understand instinctively: their lack of guile, their acceptance of wonder as a natural part of the world. When Timothy appeared at the edge of the clearing, the panther rose from its position beside Jack's chair and padded toward the boy with unmistakable welcome. "Good morning, Mr. Dalton," Timothy called softly, his voice carrying the careful respect his parents had taught him to show his elders. "I brought you something." From his jacket pocket, the boy produced a small wooden carving, a panther, crudely shaped but recognizable, whittled from a piece of pine with the concentrated effort of young hands. The figurine was clearly the work of someone just learning the craft, but the love and attention that had gone into its creation were unmistakable. Jack accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly from his growing weakness. The morphine, doctor. Henderson had left helped with the pain, but it couldn't restore the strength that was slowly ebbing from his body. Still, the sight of the carved panther brought a smile to his weathered face. "This is fine work, Timothy," he said, turning the figurine over in his palm. "You've got a real talent for this. Have you been carving long?" "My pa taught me last winter," Timothy replied, his chest swelling with pride at Jack's praise. "He said a man should know how to make things with his hands, not just use them for work." The boy's eyes moved between Jack and the real panther, which had settled beside his chair with the easy confidence of an animal completely at home in its surroundings. Sarah emerged from the cabin, carrying a pot of coffee and cups for the early morning visitors she'd learned to expect. Her presence had already transformed the domestic atmosphere around Jack's homestead, bringing an order and comfort that spoke of years spent managing a household and caring for others. "Timothy, you're here early," she observed with gentle amusement. "Your parents know where you are?" "Yes, ma'am," the boy replied quickly. "Ma said I could visit as long as I was helpful and didn't get in the way. She's coming later with some of her preserves." Jack watched the interaction between his sister and the boy with growing appreciation for what was happening. Timothy had attached himself to the story unfolding at the cabin with the wholehearted enthusiasm that only children could bring to such situations. For him, the presence of the panther wasn't an impossibility to be questioned, but a wonder to be accepted and cherished. "Tell me, Timothy," Jack said, settling back in his chair with the carved panther still in his hands, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" The boy considered the question with the seriousness that children brought to discussions of their future. "I thought maybe a telegraph operator like Pa, but now I think I'd like to be like you, someone who helps people and understands animals." Jack felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. The idea that this young boy saw him as someone to emulate was both humbling and troubling. "Being a gunfighter isn't a life I'd recommend to anyone, son. Too much violence, too much loneliness." "But you saved the panther when he was little," Timothy protested. "And you protected our town from bad men. That's not just being a gunfighter, that's being a protector." The wisdom in the boy's words struck Jack with unexpected force. In his own mind, he'd always been Jack Roughneck Dalton, the killer, the man other men feared to face. But through Timothy's eyes, he saw a different version of himself, someone whose strength had been used to shield the innocent, whose violence had served a purpose beyond mere survival. From his vest pocket, Jack withdrew his father's silver pocket watch, a timepiece that had survived the war and countless dangerous encounters. The watch had been his most precious possession, a tangible link to the family and home he'd lost, but looking at Timothy's eager face, Jack realized he'd found its proper destination. "Timothy," he said, holding out the watch, "I want you to have this. It belonged to my father, and his father before him. It's not much to look at, but it's kept good time for more years than I can count." The boy's eyes widened as he accepted the watch, his small hands closing around the warm silver with reverence. "But Mr. Dalton, this is too important. You should keep it. A watch is meant to be carried by someone with a future ahead of them." Jack replied gently, "You've got your whole life to live, Timothy. Let it remind you that time is precious and that what we do with our years matters more than how many of them we get." The Panther had been watching this exchange with keen interest, its golden eyes moving between the man and boy, as if understanding the significance of the moment. When Timothy moved closer to thank Jack properly, the great cat shifted position to make room for the boy beside Jack's chair, its acceptance of Timothy complete and unquestioning. As the morning progressed, more visitors arrived to witness the phenomenon that had captured the imagination of the entire territory. Word had spread beyond Cedar Ridge to the mining camps and ranches scattered throughout the region, and people were traveling considerable distances to see the dying gunfighter and his Panther guardian. Among the visitors was Father Miguel Santos, the traveling priest who served the Catholic families spread across the wilderness. Father Santos was a practical man who'd seen enough of frontier life to be skeptical of miracle claims, but the sight of the Panther lying peacefully beside Jack's chair gave him pause. "I've heard remarkable stories about this situation," the priest said, his accent carrying the warm tones of his native Mexico. "But seeing it with my own eyes is something else entirely. In my country, we have legends about such bonds between man and beast. They say it happens when a soul is especially pure, or when God wishes to send a sign to the world." Jack shifted uncomfortably at the suggestion that his soul might be considered pure. "Father, I'm not sure God would choose a man with my history to receive any kind of blessing. I've killed more men than I care to count." "And yet," Father Santos observed, settling into a chair Sarah had brought from the cabin, "here you are being cared for by one of God's wildest creatures. Perhaps the Almighty judges us not by our worst moments, but by our capacity for love and sacrifice." The conversation that followed was unlike any Jack had ever experienced. With Timothy curled up beside his chair, the carved panther in the boy's hands, and the real panther maintaining its protective watch, Jack found himself discussing questions of faith, redemption, and the meaning of a life lived on the edge of violence. "I saved that cub because I couldn't stand to see something helpless suffer," Jack admitted to the priest. "It wasn't heroic or noble, it was just something I had to do." "And what do you call that impulse, if not the voice of God speaking through your conscience?" Father Santos asked gently. "Evil men don't risk their lives to save helpless creatures, my friend. They exploit weakness for their own gain." Throughout the day, as more people arrived to pay their respects and witness the extraordinary bond between man and panther, Jack began to see his life through different eyes. The stories people told weren't about his gun speed or his body count. They were about the times he'd stood between innocent people and those who would harm them, about his willingness to face danger so others could live in peace. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, whose husband ran a small ranch near Devil's Canyon, spoke of the time Jack had tracked down the rustlers who'd stolen their cattle, returning the animals and refusing any payment beyond a hot meal. Tom Chen, who operated a small mining claim, told of how Jack had faced down a gang of claim jumpers without drawing his gun, using nothing but reputation and force of will to send them packing. Each story added another layer to Jack's understanding of his own legacy. He'd thought of himself as a necessary evil, a man whose violence served a purpose, but who remained fundamentally tainted by the blood on his hands. But the people of Cedar Ridge and the surrounding territory saw him differently, as a protector whose strength had made their lives possible. The silver pocket watch, now resting in Timothy's pocket, had become more than just a family heirloom. It represented Jack's recognition that his true legacy wouldn't be measured in gunfights won or enemies defeated, but in the positive impact he'd had on the lives of good people trying to build something decent in a harsh land. As evening approached and the visitors began to depart, Timothy remained beside Jack's chair, his small hand occasionally reaching out to touch the Panther's flank with the familiarity of someone who'd been accepted into an exclusive circle. The boy's presence had brought a lightness to Jack's final days that he'd never expected to experience. "Timothy," Jack said as the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, "I want you to promise me something. When you're grown and have children of your own, tell them this story. Tell them about the Panther who repaid kindness with loyalty, and about how even the wildest creatures understand the importance of keeping faith with those who show them mercy." The boy nodded solemnly, his hand moving to the pocket where the silver watch rested. "I promise, Mr. Dalton. I'll tell them, and I'll make sure they understand that being strong means protecting things that are smaller and weaker than you are." The Panther's response to this conversation was a low rumble of contentment, as if the great cat approved of the lesson being passed from man to boy. In the growing twilight, with the sounds of the wilderness awakening around them, Jack felt a peace he'd never known was possible. The silver pocket watch would continue its journey through time, carrying with it the memory of an unlikely friendship and the understanding that true legacy lives not in what we take from the world, but in what we leave behind for future generations to cherish and protect. The threatening letter arrived with the morning mail delivery, carried by a nervous postal rider who kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Jack recognized the crude handwriting immediately. It belonged to Frank Brennan, Cole's younger brother, and the one member of the outlaw family who'd been smart enough to avoid the confrontation at Devil's Canyon. "Jack Dalton," the letter read in pencil scratched across cheap paper. "You killed my brother and his boys, but the Brennan name ain't finished yet. I got 6 good men riding with me now, and we're coming for you. Won't be no quick death like Cole got. We're gonna make you suffer for what you done. 3 days, and then we settle accounts." The Panther's reaction to the letter was immediate and unmistakable. The great cat had been resting peacefully beside Jack's chair when he'd begun reading, but as Jack's tension mounted, the animal's posture changed dramatically. Its ears flattened against its skull, its golden eyes narrowed to predatory slits, and a low growl rumbled from deep in its chest. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, reaching out to stroke the Panther's flank. "You sense it too, don't you? Trouble coming our way." Sarah, who had been tending to Jack's wound with the careful attention of someone experienced in caring for the injured, looked up from her work with concern. "What does the letter say, Jack?" Jack handed her the crude message, watching as her face grew pale with worry. "Frank Brennan is Cole's younger brother. He's not as smart as Cole was, but he's twice as mean. If he's gathered 6 men, he's planning something more than just a quick revenge killing." The Panther rose from its resting position and padded to the cabin's front window, its massive frame tense with alertness. It stood there for several minutes, nostrils flaring as it tested the wind for scents that might indicate approaching danger. The animal's behavior was that of a creature preparing for battle, and Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with his failing health. "We need to get word to the sheriff," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "Surely the law can protect you from these outlaws." Jack's laugh was bitter and weak. "The nearest sheriff is 3 days' ride away in Carson City, and Frank's not fool enough to wait for legal intervention. Besides, what's the law going to do station deputies here indefinitely to protect a dying gunfighter?" Throughout the day, as word of the threat spread, the people of Cedar Ridge found themselves facing a decision that would define their community's character. Jack Dalton had protected them for years, standing as a barrier between their peaceful lives and the violence that plagued the frontier. Now, when he was at his most vulnerable, they had the opportunity to return that protection. The debate began in earnest when Tom Morrison arrived with supplies and news that Frank Brennan's gang had been spotted 2 days' ride south, moving slowly but steadily toward Jack's cabin. The livery stable owner brought with him a delegation from town, businessmen, ranchers, and working folks who'd come to discuss the situation. "Some folks think we should try to move you into town," Morrison explained, his hat in his hands as he spoke. "The hotel's got a room, and we could post guards to watch for trouble." Jack shook his head weakly. "Moving me would likely kill me faster than Frank's bullet. Besides, a hotel room in town just puts innocent people in the line of fire when the shooting starts." The Panther had remained on high alert throughout the discussions, its behavior growing more agitated as the day progressed. It paced restlessly around the cabin's perimeter, occasionally pausing to stare intently at the forest trails that led to Jack's remote homestead. The animal's instincts were clearly warning of approaching danger, and its protective instincts were in full display. Dr. Henderson arrived in the afternoon, having ridden hard from Cedar Ridge after hearing about the threat. His examination of Jack revealed what everyone could see: the wounded man was growing weaker by the hour, his body finally beginning to succumb to the internal damage caused by Cole Brennan's bullet. "You've got maybe 2 days left," the doctor said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of delivering such news. "Your body's shutting down, Jack. Even if we could move you, the journey would probably finish what the bullet started." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Frank Brennan was racing against time to reach Jack before natural death claimed its victim. In his desire for revenge, the outlaw was competing with mortality itself for the right to end Jack Dalton's life. As evening approached, the Panther's behavior became increasingly protective and agitated. It positioned itself between the cabin and the most likely approaches, its muscles coiled with the readiness to spring into action. When Timothy Garrett arrived for his daily visit, the great cat's greeting was subdued, as if the animal understood that the time for gentle companionship was drawing to a close. "The Panther knows they're coming, doesn't it?" Timothy asked, his young voice filled with concern as he watched the animal's restless movements. "Animals sense things we miss," Jack replied, his hand moving automatically to check his Colt .45. Even dying, his instincts remained sharp, and he could feel the approaching storm as clearly as the Panther could smell it on the wind. He's preparing to protect what he considers his territory. Sarah had been quiet throughout most of the day, but as the sun began to set, she finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. "Jack, I can't bear the thought of you facing those men alone. You're dying. You shouldn't have to spend your last days fighting. Sometimes a man doesn't get to choose how his story ends." Jack replied gently, his voice carrying the acceptance of someone who'd lived with violence long enough to understand its inevitability. "Frank's coming whether I'm ready or not. At least this way, I get to face him on my own terms, in my own place, with the best friend I've ever had standing beside me." The Panther seemed to understand that it was being discussed, lifting its massive head to regard Jack with eyes that held both loyalty and determination. There was no question in the animal's posture. It would stand with the man who had saved its life, regardless of the odds or the consequences. As night fell, the people of Cedar Ridge faced their moment of decision. They could retreat to the safety of town and let Jack face his fate alone, or they could stand with the man who had protected them for so many years. The choice, when it came, surprised no one who truly knew the character of the frontier community. Billy Garrett arrived first, carrying his hunting rifle and wearing the grim expression of a man who'd made peace with a dangerous decision. Martha wanted to come too. He told Jack, "But I convinced her to stay with the children. She sends her prayers, and this." He handed Jack a small bundle wrapped in cloth, fresh-baked bread, still warm from the oven. Tom Morrison came next, followed by several of the local ranchers and even Father Santos, who carried no weapon but brought with him the moral authority of his calling. One by one, they took positions around Jack's cabin, creating a defensive perimeter that would force Frank Brennan's gang to fight for every foot of ground. "You folks don't need to do this," Jack protested, though his voice carried gratitude along with concern. "This is my fight, my past catching up to me." "No, Jack," Billy Garrett replied, speaking for the assembled group. "This is our fight too. You've stood between us and trouble for years. Now it's our turn to stand with you." The Panther's reaction to this show of solidarity was remarkable. The great cat seemed to understand that these humans were allies rather than threats, and its protective behavior expanded to include the entire group. It moved among them like a four-legged general, checking their positions and offering its presence as a source of confidence and strength. The threatening letter, now crumpled and forgotten, had served its purpose. It had forced the people of Cedar Ridge to confront the reality of what Jack Dalton meant to their community, and their response had transformed a dying gunfighter's last stand into something far more significant, a community's declaration that loyalty and protection flowed both ways. As the defenders settled into their positions for what promised to be a long and dangerous wait, Jack felt a profound sense of completion. He'd spent his adult life as a solitary figure, facing danger alone and trusting no one but himself. Now, in his final hours, he was surrounded by people who'd chosen to share his risk, and a panther whose loyalty transcended the boundaries between species. The silver pocket watch in Timothy's possession continued its steady tick, marking the passage of time toward an inevitable confrontation. But the sound no longer seemed ominous. Instead, it had become a reminder that some moments in life were worth every second they contained, regardless of how they might end. The old newspaper clipping had been tucked away in Jack's leather journal for so many years that the paper had yellowed and the ink had faded to a pale brown. Sarah discovered it while searching for writing materials to pen a letter to their cousin in Denver, and the headline that caught her eye changed everything they thought they understood about Jack's past. "Gunfighter prevents tribal war." Read the banner across the top of the Nevada Territory Daily, dated August 15, 1873. Below the headline, a detailed account described how Jack Dalton had intervened in a dispute between white settlers and the Northern Paiute tribe, preventing what could have escalated into a bloody conflict that would have claimed dozens of lives on both sides. Sarah read the article aloud to the assembled defenders, her voice growing stronger as the full scope of her brother's actions became clear. According to the newspaper, a group of miners had accused the Paiute of stealing horses and had prepared to attack the tribal encampment. Jack had investigated the allegations and discovered that the horses had actually been taken by a gang of rustlers who deliberately left evidence pointing toward the Native Americans. Mr. Dalton tracked the real thieves to their hideout in the Badlands. Sarah continued reading and recovered not only the stolen horses but also several Paiute children who had been kidnapped for sale to unscrupulous traders. His actions prevented an attack that would have resulted in the deaths of innocent families and likely sparked a wider conflict throughout the territory. The article went on to describe how Jack had been honored by both the territorial governor and chief running bear of the Northern Paiute, who had declared him a brother to all who seek justice over vengeance. The ceremony had taken place at Willow Creek, the same location where Jack would later save the panther cub. Timothy, who had been listening with rapt attention, suddenly straightened in his chair. "Mr. Dalton, the old Indian who came to see you yesterday, he said something about Willow Creek, didn't he?" Jack nodded slowly, the memory surfacing through the haze of pain and medication. Joseph Running Bear, the elderly Paiute shaman who was Chief Running Bear's grandson, had indeed visited the cabin. At the time, Jack had attributed the visit to simple curiosity about the panther, but now he began to understand there was much more to the story. He said the panther cub was sacred, Jack recalled, his voice growing stronger as the pieces fell into place. Said it was a spirit animal that his grandfather had blessed before it disappeared into the wilderness. I thought he was just telling old stories. Father Santos, who had been quietly contemplating the implications of the newspaper article, spoke up with growing excitement. In many Native American traditions, sacred animals serve as guardians and guides. If this panther was blessed by a tribal elder and then saved by the same man who had protected the tribe, the spiritual significance would be profound. The panther itself seemed to sense that it was the subject of intense discussion. The great cat had been maintaining its protective watch at the cabin's perimeter, but now it approached the group with measured steps. Its golden eyes moved from person to person, as if assessing their understanding of something important. Sarah set down the newspaper clipping and looked at her brother with new comprehension. "Jack, you're not just a gunfighter who happened to save an animal. You're part of something larger, a pattern of protection and loyalty that goes back years." The revelation reframed everything about Jack's relationship with the panther. What had seemed like a remarkable coincidence, a wild animal returning to aid the man who had saved it, now appeared to be part of a deeper spiritual connection that involved tribal blessings, sacred animals, and the mysterious ways that acts of compassion could echo through time. Dr. Henderson, who had remained at the cabin to monitor Jack's condition, examined the newspaper clipping with the careful attention of a man trying to understand medical evidence. "Jack, when you saved those Paiute children, do you remember anything else about the ceremony? Any details that might explain the panther's behavior?" Jack closed his eyes, reaching back through years of memory to that long-ago day at Willow Creek. The details came slowly, emerging from the depths of recollection like objects surfacing from deep water. "Chief Running Bear performed a blessing ceremony," Jack said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a half-remembered dream. "He said the spirits of the wilderness would remember my actions and that I would never face death alone in their domain. At the time, I thought it was just ceremonial talk, the kind of thing leaders say to be polite." The panther had drawn closer during Jack's recollection, settling beside his chair with the familiar rumble of contentment that had become the soundtrack to their remarkable friendship. But now there was something different in the animal's posture, a sense of recognition, as if it too remembered that sacred day at Willow Creek. The chief also blessed a young panther cub that had been brought to the ceremony, Jack continued, his voice growing stronger as more details emerged. "Said it was a spirit guardian that would protect those who showed mercy to the defenseless. The cub disappeared that same night, and I figured it had just returned to the wild where it belonged." Timothy leaned forward in his chair, his young mind making connections that the adults were still processing. "Mr. Dalton, what if the cub you found a few years later was the same one from the ceremony? What if the blessing meant it was supposed to find you?" The possibility hung in the air like morning mist, both impossible to grasp and impossible to dismiss. Father Santos crossed himself, slowly, his expression thoughtful as he considered the theological implications of what they were discussing. "In the Bible, we read of angels ministering to those in need," the priest said quietly. "Perhaps God works through his creatures in ways that our limited understanding cannot fully comprehend. The blessing of a holy man, the salvation of a sacred animal, the return of that animal in the hour of greatest need, these things speak to a design beyond mere coincidence." Billy Garrett, who had been standing guard near the window, turned to address the group with the practical concern of a man preparing for battle. "Whether it's coincidence, blessing, or divine intervention, we've still got Frank Brennan and his gang headed our way. The question is, does knowing about this blessing change anything about how we handle the threat?" The panther's response was immediate and unmistakable. The great cat rose to its feet and padded to the cabin door, its massive frame blocking the entrance as it had that first night. But now its protective stance carried additional meaning. This wasn't just an animal defending a friend, but a sacred guardian fulfilling a spiritual obligation that had been set in motion years before. "It changes everything." Jack said with sudden clarity, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present. "I've spent my whole adult life thinking I was nothing more than a killer, a necessary evil in a harsh land. But if Joseph Running Bear is right, if the Panther's presence here is part of something larger, then maybe my life has had a purpose beyond the violence." Sarah reached for her brother's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Jack, you've always had a purpose. You protected people. You stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. The blessing didn't create that purpose, it recognized something that was already there." The newspaper clipping, now smoothed flat on the table beside them, served as tangible proof of the truth. Sarah spoke. The faded ink might have obscured some details, but the essential facts remained clear. Jack Dalton had prevented a war, saved lives, and earned the respect of people who understood the true meaning of honor. Dr. Henderson checked his pocket watch and frowned. According to the letter, Frank Brennan planned to arrive today. The sun's getting low, and if he's planning an attack, it'll likely come at dusk when the light favors someone approaching from the forest. As if summoned by the doctor's words, the panther's ears pricked forward, and its golden eyes focused intently on the tree line beyond the cabin's clearing. The animal's entire body tensed with alertness, and a low growl rumbled from deep in its chest, not the contented purr they'd grown accustomed to, but the warning sound of a predator detecting danger. "They're coming," Jack said simply, his hand moving automatically to check his Colt 45. The movement was painful and slow, a reminder of how much his condition had deteriorated, but his grip remained steady. "I can feel it in the air, same as he can." The transformation in the assembled defenders was immediate. Men who had been sitting in comfortable conversation suddenly became alert sentries, checking their weapons and moving to positions that would provide the best fields of fire. The discussion of spiritual blessings and sacred animals gave way to the harsh practicalities of preparing for combat. But the newspaper clipping remained on the table, its yellowed surface catching the last rays of sunlight that slanted through the cabin's windows. The story it told had changed their understanding of the events unfolding around them, transforming Jack's last stand from a simple gunfight into something approaching legend. Timothy clutched the silver pocket watch in his hands, its steady ticking a reminder that time was running short. The boy had listened to the revelations about Jack's past with the wide-eyed wonder of youth, but now he faced the reality that the man who had become his hero was about to fight his final battle. "Mr. Dalton," Timothy said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sounds of men preparing for war. "When this is over, I'm going to tell everyone about the blessing and the panther and what really happened here. I'm going to make sure people remember the whole story, not just the fighting." Jack smiled at the boy's earnest promise, recognizing in Timothy's words the guarantee that truth would survive whatever violence was about to unfold. The silver watch would continue its journey through time, carrying with it the memory of a gunfighter who had been transformed by understanding the true nature of his calling. The panther moved to the window where Billy Garrett stood watch, its massive presence both comforting and intimidating. The animal's behavior suggested that it understood the approaching confrontation would determine not just Jack's fate, but the completion of a spiritual obligation that had begun with a tribal blessing beside Willow Creek. As the first shadows of evening began to stretch across the cabin's clearing, the yellowed newspaper clipping seemed to glow with importance. It had revealed the hidden pattern that connected Jack's past acts of compassion to his present circumstances, showing that what appeared to be coincidence was actually the unfolding of a deeper design that honored those who protected the innocent and defended the defenseless. The sacred panther, blessed by a Paiute chief and saved by a man who had prevented a war, prepared to fulfill its destiny as guardian and protector. The blessing that had seemed like ceremonial words spoken over a sacred animal had become a living reality, manifest in the loyalty of a magnificent creature that understood the true meaning of keeping faith with those who showed mercy to the helpless. The loaded Winchester rifle lay across Jack's lap like a familiar friend, its weight both comforting and sobering. He'd cleaned and checked the weapon with the methodical care of a man who understood that his life might depend on its proper function, though his weakened condition made even these simple tasks exhausting. The rifle represented more than just a tool of war. It was a symbol of Jack's violent past and his determination to protect those he'd come to care about in his final hours. Dr. Henderson had protested the wisdom of Jack participating in any coming battle, arguing that the effort might kill him faster than Frank Brennan's bullets. But Jack had dismissed the doctor's concerns with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who'd always understood that some things were worth dying for. "Doc, I'm going to die anyway," Jack had said as he loaded cartridges into the Winchester's magazine. "The only question is whether I go out fighting to protect good people or lying in bed feeling sorry for myself. That's not much of a choice for a man who spent his life standing between innocent folks and those who'd harm them." The Panther had watched these preparations with keen interest, its golden eyes tracking every movement as Jack readied himself for what would likely be his final gunfight. The great cat seemed to understand the significance of the ritual, settling itself in a position where it could observe both Jack and the approaches to the cabin. Sarah had tried one last time to convince her brother to reconsider, her voice tight with the emotion of someone watching a loved one prepare for almost certain death. "Jack, you can barely hold that rifle steady. How can you hope to face 6 armed men in your condition?" "I won't be facing them alone," Jack had replied, nodding toward the Panther. "And I won't be the same man they expect to find. Frank Brennan thinks he's coming to kill a dying gunfighter. Instead, he's going to find a community that's decided to stand together." The defensive preparations had been completed throughout the afternoon, with the men from Cedar Ridge taking positions that would allow them to create crossfires and protect each other during the expected assault. Billy Garrett had positioned himself near the stable where he could cover the main approach to the cabin. Tom Morrison had taken the loft of the small barn, giving him an elevated view of the entire clearing. Father Santos, despite carrying no weapon, had stationed himself where he could tend to wounded and offer spiritual comfort to those who might need it. The Panther's behavior had grown increasingly agitated as the day progressed, its restless movements suggesting that it could sense the approaching danger with senses far more acute than those possessed by humans. The great cat had begun a systematic patrol of the cabin's perimeter, marking its territory with scent and making its presence known to any potential intruders. Timothy had been sent back to town despite his protests, but not before Jack had given him specific instructions about what to do if the worst happened. "You tell people what really occurred here," Jack had said, pressing the boy's hand between his own. "Tell them about the blessing and the Panther and how sometimes friendship can cross the boundaries between species. Make sure they understand that what happened here was about more than just gunfighting." As evening approached, the tension in the air became almost palpable. The defenders checked their weapons repeatedly, their movements betraying the nervous energy of men preparing for violence. Even Father Santos, whose faith had sustained him through many dangerous situations, seemed affected by the weight of approaching conflict. Jack had positioned himself on the cabin's front porch, where his Winchester could cover the main approach while allowing him to remain seated. His wound made standing for extended periods impossible, but from his chair, he could still command the central area of the defensive position. The Panther had taken its place beside him, its massive frame serving as both psychological deterrent and physical protection. 37 years, Jack said quietly, speaking to no one in particular as the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks. "That's how long I've been carrying a gun and using it to settle disputes. Never thought I'd end my career defending my own front porch with a Panther for backup." The irony wasn't lost on any of the assembled defenders. Jack Dalton, the feared gunfighter who'd spent decades as a solitary figure, was making his last stand surrounded by friends and protected by an animal that represented the mysterious connections binding all living things together. Dr. Henderson had remained despite the danger, his medical bag positioned where he could quickly reach anyone who might be wounded in the coming fight. Jack, I want you to know that regardless of what happens tonight, you've given this community something to be proud of. People will remember how you brought them together. The Winchester's familiar weight across Jack's lap reminded him of countless other times he'd prepared for gunfights, but this occasion felt fundamentally different. In the past, his weapons had been tools of solitary violence, instruments he'd used to impose his will on dangerous situations. Tonight, the rifle represented something else entirely, a means of protecting people he'd come to love and defending values that transcended his own survival. Billy Garrett's voice carried across the clearing from his position near the stable. Movement in the tree line. Looks like riders approaching from the south trail. The Panther's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The great cat rose to its feet, every muscle in its powerful frame tensing with readiness. Its lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing fangs that gleamed white in the fading light. The animal's golden eyes fixed on the forest edge, where the first signs of approaching riders had been spotted. 6 men, just like the letter promised. Tom Morrison called down from the barn loft. Frank Brennan's in the lead. They're taking their time, probably trying to figure out why there are so many people here. Jack worked the Winchester's lever action, chambering around and feeling the familiar satisfaction of a weapon ready for use. The metallic sound seemed to galvanize the other defenders, and the clearing filled with the subtle sounds of men preparing for battle, safety catches being released, cartridges being checked, final prayers being whispered. "Frank Brennan," Jack called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. "You came for me, and here I am. But you should know that these folks standing with me aren't part of our quarrel. You want revenge for your brother. You can have it. But you'll leave the innocent people out of this." The response came in Frank Brennan's voice, rougher and less controlled than his brother Cole's had been. "Dalton, you killed my blood, and now I'm going to kill yours. Don't matter how many townspeople you got hiding behind, we came prepared for a fight." The Panther's growl grew louder at the sound of the outlaw's voice, the animal's instinctive recognition of threat combining with its protective loyalty to Jack. The great cat had positioned itself where it could spring into action at a moment's notice, its powerful haunches coiled with the potential energy of a natural-born killer. Father Santos had begun a quiet prayer in Spanish, his voice carrying the rhythm of words spoken in times of crisis. The other defenders listened to the familiar cadence with comfort, drawing strength from the priest's faith, even as they prepared to take lives in defense of their own. The loaded Winchester represented more than just Jack's final preparation for battle. It symbolized the transformation of a solitary gunfighter into the focal point of a community's determination to protect what it valued most. The rifle's weight across his legs reminded Jack that he was no longer fighting just for his own survival, but for the preservation of something larger and more important than any individual life. As the last light of day faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Jack Dalton prepared to fight his final battle. The Panther beside him served as both guardian and symbol, a living reminder that loyalty and courage could transcend the boundaries between species, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships produced the strongest bonds. The Winchester was ready. The Panther was ready. The community of Cedar Ridge had declared itself ready to stand with the man who had protected them for so many years. All that remained was for Frank Brennan to make his choice between wisdom and vengeance, between retreat and the violence that would determine how this remarkable story would end. The Panther's roar shattered the mountain silence, like thunder rolling across the peaks, a sound so primal and powerful that it seemed to awaken something ancient in the wilderness itself. The great cat's voice echoed off the canyon walls and reverberated through the forest, carrying with it a message that transcended human understanding. This was a declaration of war, a promise of protection, and a challenge that reached back to the dawn of time when such battles determined the fate of territories and the survival of the strong. Frank Brennan's horse reared at the sound, nearly unseating the outlaw leader as the animal's instincts screamed warnings about the apex predator that had just announced its presence. The other members of his gang fought to control their own mounts, their carefully planned assault beginning to unravel before the first shot had been fired. "What in hell was that?" shouted Pete Rawlings, Frank's lieutenant and a man whose nerve had carried him through dozens of robberies and gunfights. But there was something in the Panther's roar that spoke to fears buried deep in human DNA, fears that no amount of experience with violence could completely overcome. The Panther stood at the edge of Jack's porch, its magnificent frame silhouetted against the cabin's lamplight, like some mythical guardian creature from the stories of ancient peoples. Its golden eyes reflected the flickering flames with an inner fire that seemed to burn with supernatural intensity. The great cat's lips were pulled back in a snarl that revealed fangs capable of crushing bone, and its muscles rippled beneath its sleek black coat with the promise of devastating violence. From the forest edge, Frank Brennan tried to regain control of the situation that had already begun to slip away from him. "It's just an animal," he yelled to his men, though his own voice carried a tremor that betrayed his growing uncertainty. "6 guns against one dying man and his pet cat. We can handle this." But the responses from the wilderness told a different story. The Panther's roar had awakened something in the forest that the outlaws hadn't anticipated. From the darkness beyond the clearing came answering calls, the howls of wolves that had heard their ancient cousin's challenge, the screams of mountain cats that recognized the voice of a fellow predator, the harsh cries of predatory birds that understood that violence was about to erupt in their domain. Jack felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with his weakening condition. The Panther's roar had been magnificent and terrifying, but it was the response from the wilderness that truly amazed him. It was as if the entire forest ecosystem had aligned itself with the great cat, creating a symphony of predatory voices that transformed the mountain clearing into something approaching a primitive battlefield. "Sounds like your friend has called for backup," Billy Garrett observed from his position near the stable, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and nervous humor. "Never heard anything like that in 30 years of living in these mountains." The Panther's roar had accomplished something that no amount of strategic planning could have achieved. It had thrown Frank Brennan's gang into disarray, while simultaneously announcing to every living thing within miles that a Panther's roar, significant confrontation was about to take place. The psychological impact on the outlaws was immediate and obvious, their horses still fighting to flee from the source of that terrifying sound. Dr. Henderson, who had witnessed many strange things during his years as a frontier physician, found himself staring at the Panther with something approaching religious awe. "That wasn't just an animal making noise," he said quietly. "That was a war cry. That cat is preparing for battle like a human warrior calling on his ancestors for strength." The truth of the doctor's words became evident as the Panther began to move. The great cat descended from the porch with fluid grace, its enormous paws making no sound on the wooden steps. But there was nothing stealthy about its approach. Now this was a predator, announcing its presence and challenging any who would threaten its territory. From their positions in the tree line, Frank Brennan's gang found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. They had come prepared to fight a dying gunfighter and whatever townspeople might be foolish enough to stand with him. Instead, they were confronting a supernatural-seeming alliance between human defenders and a creature that belonged more to legend than to the rational world of frontier violence. "Frank, maybe we should reconsider this," called out Jake Morrison, the youngest member of the gang and the one most clearly affected by the Panther's display. "That thing ain't natural. Look at the size of it." But Frank Brennan had committed too much to this revenge mission to retreat now. His reputation, his leadership of the gang, and his obligation to his dead brother's memory all demanded that he follow through with the attack, regardless of unexpected complications. "We came here to kill Jack Dalton, and that's what we're gonna do," Frank shouted, his voice carrying across the clearing with forced bravado. I don't care if he's got a whole zoo guarding him. My brother's death demands satisfaction." The panther's response was to emit a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The sound was so deep and powerful that it could be felt as much as heard, a physical manifestation of the great cat's readiness for violence. The animal began to pace in front of the cabin, its movements hypnotic and menacing as it displayed the fluid power that made it one of nature's most efficient killers. Jack watched the panther's preparation with a mixture of gratitude and concern. He had never imagined that the cub he'd saved at Willow Creek would grow into such a magnificent and formidable creature, and he certainly hadn't anticipated that their reunion would culminate in the animal preparing to fight beside him in his final battle. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, though he made no attempt to restrain the panther's aggressive display. "Save your strength for when they actually make their move. Let them think about what they're facing for a few more minutes." The distinctive roar had served its purpose as both battle cry and psychological weapon, but it had also accomplished something more subtle and perhaps more important. The sound had transformed the character of the confrontation from a simple revenge killing into something approaching a mythical contest between the forces of loyalty and vengeance, between the bonds that unite communities and the violence that tears them apart. Father Santos had stopped his quiet praying to stare at the panther with undisguised wonder. "In all my years of ministry," he said softly, "I have never witnessed anything that spoke so clearly of divine intervention. That animal's roar was like the voice of justice itself, demanding to be heard." The echoes of the panther's challenge were still reverberating through the mountain valleys when Frank Brennan made his decision. Whether driven by wounded pride, loyalty to his dead brother, or simple inability to retreat from a course of action he'd committed himself to, the outlaw leader spurred his horse forward into the clearing. "Come on, boys," he yelled to his men. "Time to finish this." The battle for Jack's cabin was about to begin, and the panther's roar had ensured that it would be unlike any gunfight the Nevada Territory had ever witnessed. The great cat's challenge had awakened not just the wilderness around them, but something primitive and powerful in all the participants, a recognition that this confrontation would determine more than just the fate of individual lives. As the first shots rang out across the clearing, the panther's roar continued to echo in the memory of everyone present, a sound that would haunt their dreams and define their understanding of what it meant to stand together in the face of overwhelming odds. The distinctive battle cry had announced that this was no ordinary fight, but a contest that would test the bonds between species and the power of loyalty to transcend the boundaries that normally separate the civilized world from the savage beauty of the wild. Fresh blood matted the panther's sleek black coat where Frank Brennan's bullet had grazed its shoulder, but the wound only seemed to fuel the great cat's fury. The panther's battle scars were already forming parallel lines, where an outlaw's knife had found its mark during the chaotic melee, and a shallow cut across its flank, where another bullet had come too close for comfort. These injuries mirrored the old scars that crisscrossed Jack's weathered body, creating a visual bond between man and beast that spoke to their shared experience of violence and survival. The gunfight had erupted with devastating swiftness once Frank Brennan committed his gang to the attack. Jack's Winchester had spoken first, its sharp report echoing across the clearing as the dying gunfighter proved that his aim remained true even as his strength failed. Pete Rawlings had toppled from his horse, clutching his chest where Jack's bullet had found its mark with the precision of a man who'd spent decades perfecting his deadly craft. But it was the panther's intervention that had truly turned the tide of battle. As the outlaws spread out to surround the cabin, the great cat had launched itself into combat with the savage grace of a creature born to kill. Its first target had been Jake Morrison, the youngest member of Frank's gang, who had made the fatal mistake of dismounting too close to the panther's position. The attack had been swift and brutal. The Panther had covered the distance between itself and Morrison in two powerful bounds, its massive frame colliding with the outlaw with the force of an avalanche. Morrison's scream had been cut short as the great cat's fangs found their target, but the young outlaw had managed to get his knife into play before succumbing, leaving the Panther with fresh wounds that only increased its ferocity. Billy Garrett had watched the Panther's assault with a mixture of horror and admiration. "Never seen anything like it," he called out to Jack between shots. "That cat fights like it, understands exactly what's at stake here." The Panther did seem to possess an almost human understanding of the battle's strategic elements. Rather than simply attacking with blind fury, the great cat had systematically targeted the outlaws who posed the greatest threat to Jack and the other defenders. It had driven off Frank's horse with a terrifying display of claws and fangs, forcing the gang leader to continue the fight on foot where his mobility was severely limited. Tom Morrison's rifle fire from the barn loft had proved devastating to the outlaws' assault, but it was the combination of human marksmanship and the Panther's supernatural-seeming combat abilities that had broken the gang's coordination. The outlaws had come prepared to fight men, not to face a creature that seemed to embody the wild ferocity of the mountain wilderness itself. Dr. Henderson had tried to stay out of the direct combat, but when Frank Brennan had attempted to flank the cabin's defenses, the doctor had surprised everyone by producing a small pistol and proving that his medical training included an understanding of anatomy that made him a remarkably effective marksman. His shot had shattered Brennan's gun arm, effectively removing the gang leader from the fight. "Hippocratic oath says, 'Do no harm,'" Dr. Henderson had explained to Father Santos, "but it doesn't say anything about preventing harm to innocent people." The battle's climax had come when Timothy Garrett, who was supposed to be safely back in town, had appeared at the edge of the clearing, with tears streaming down his face. The boy had ridden out, despite his parents' instructions, driven by a desperate need to be with Jack during what he somehow knew would be the gunfighter's final moments. "Timothy, get down!" Billy Garrett had shouted to his son, but the boy's appearance had distracted him from the wounded outlaw who was raising his rifle for one last shot at Jack. Without hesitation, Jack had pushed himself up from his chair, his Winchester swinging toward the threat. But his weakened condition made his movements slow, and the outlaw's rifle was already aimed and ready to fire. It was then that the Panther had made its most crucial intervention, launching itself through the air with such force that it knocked both Jack and the threatening outlaw to the ground. The collision had probably saved Jack's life, but it had cost him what little strength remained in his failing body. As he lay on the cabin's porch with the Panther's warm bulk pressed against his side, Jack could feel his life ebbing away with each labored breath. The bullet wound that had been slowly killing him had finally won its race against time, aided by the physical trauma of the battle. But Timothy was safe. The boy knelt beside Jack and the wounded Panther, his small hands moving gently over the great cat's injured flank as tears coursed down his cheeks. The Panther, despite its own wounds, had positioned itself protectively over Jack's prone form, its golden eyes still alert for any remaining threats. "You saved him," Timothy whispered to the Panther, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved Mr. Dalton, and you saved me too." The Panther's response was a weak but unmistakable purr, a sound that spoke of satisfaction and completion despite the pain of its injuries. The great cat had fulfilled its purpose, repaying the debt it owed to the man who had saved its life years ago. The fresh scars it now bore were badges of honor, proof of loyalty that transcended the boundaries between species. Sarah had emerged from the cabin where she'd been tending to wounded defenders, her face pale with shock as she saw her brother's condition. "Jack, hold on," she pleaded, kneeling beside him on the porch. "Dr. Henderson, can you do something?" But Jack's eyes had already taken on the glassy look of approaching death, and his breathing had become the shallow, irregular pattern that experienced frontier people recognized as a body's final struggle. The gunfight had ended. The outlaws were dead or scattered, but the cost of victory had been higher than anyone had anticipated. "Sarah," Jack whispered, his voice so weak that she had to lean close to hear him. "Tell everyone what happened here. Tell them about the Panther and the blessing, and how sometimes the best friendships come from the most unexpected places." The Panther's mournful cry echoed across the clearing as Jack Dalton drew his final breath, a sound of grief so profound that it seemed to come from the very soul of the wilderness itself. The great cat's battle scars glistened with fresh blood in the lamplight, but its wounds were nothing compared to the emotional devastation of losing the human who had defined its understanding of loyalty and love. Frank Brennan's gang had been defeated, their leader's quest for revenge ending in failure and death. But the true victory belonged to the Panther, whose courage and devotion had ensured that Jack's final moments were spent surrounded by friends and family, rather than alone in violent death. The fresh scars the great cat now bore were proof that some bonds are worth any sacrifice, and that loyalty, once given, demands nothing less than everything in return. The stone memorial that marked Jack Dalton's grave was simple and unpretentious, carved from local granite by Tom Morrison, who discovered he had an unexpected talent for working stone. The inscription read simply, "Jack Roughneck Dalton, he saved a life and found his soul." Below these words, Morrison had carved a remarkably detailed image of a panther, its head raised as if scanning the horizon for threats that would never come. For 3 days after Jack's death, the panther had maintained an unwavering vigil beside the fresh grave, refusing food and water despite the gentle entreaties of Sarah and the other townspeople who had come to pay their respects. The great cat lay stretched along the length of the grave, its massive head resting on its paws, its golden eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross that would later be replaced by the stone marker. On the 4th morning, Timothy Garrett had arrived at the gravesite, carrying fresh water and strips of jerky, determined to coax the mourning animal into eating. He'd found the panther in the same position, but something in its posture had changed. The great cat's ears were no longer flattened with grief, and its eyes, while still sad, had regained some of their alert intelligence. "You have to eat something," Timothy had whispered, settling beside the panther with the easy acceptance of childhood. "Mr. Dalton wouldn't want you to die too. He'd want you to live and remember him." As if understanding the boy's words, the panther had slowly raised its head and accepted the offered water, lapping gratefully from the tin cup Timothy held for it. The simple act of caring for the animal had created a bond between boy and panther that would last for years to come, a connection that bridged the gap left by Jack's death. The funeral itself had drawn people from across the Nevada territory, creating what many described as the largest gathering in the region's history. Miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and their families had traveled for days to pay their respects to the man who had protected them for so many years. But it was the presence of Joseph Running Bear and a delegation of Paiute elders that had truly transformed the occasion from a simple funeral into something approaching a sacred ceremony. The spirit guardian has completed its sacred duty. Joseph Running Bear had intoned as he placed traditional offerings on Jack's grave. The blessing given at Willow Creek has been fulfilled, and the circle is now complete. The panther will return to the wild, but it will carry with it the memory of a friendship that honored both worlds. Father Santos had conducted the Christian service with his usual dignity, but he had also welcomed the Paiute blessing as a recognition that some truths transcended religious boundaries. "Whether we call it divine providence or the wisdom of the wilderness," the priest had said, "what we witnessed here was a love that conquered death itself." Sarah had decided to remain in Cedar Ridge, using her inheritance from her late husband to purchase property near her brother's grave. She'd established a small school where she taught reading and writing to the children of the territory, including Timothy Garrett, who had become her most devoted student and the unofficial keeper of Jack's story. "Every child who passes through this school will learn about your uncle and his panther," she'd promised during one of her daily visits to the grave. They'll understand that kindness creates connections that can last a lifetime, and that sometimes the most important friendships are the ones that surprise us most. The Panther's visits to the grave had established a pattern that would continue for years. The great cat would appear at dawn and sunset, sitting quietly beside the stone memorial for exactly the length of time it took the sun to clear the mountains or disappear behind them. During these visits, the Panther never showed any aggression toward the people who came to pay their respects, instead maintaining a dignified presence that spoke of ongoing grief and enduring loyalty. Timothy had taken to leaving small offerings beside the grave, fresh flowers when they were available, interesting stones he'd found during his explorations, and occasionally carved wooden figures that showed his improving skill as a craftsman. The Panther seemed to approve of these gifts, sometimes touching them gently with its massive paw, as if acknowledging the boy's devotion to Jack's memory. The legend that grew around Jack Dalton and his Panther guardian had spread far beyond the Nevada territory, carried by travelers and newspaper correspondents who had heard the remarkable story from witnesses. But those who had actually been present during Jack's final days understood that the true meaning of what had occurred couldn't be captured in sensational headlines or exaggerated retellings. Dr. Henderson had documented the medical aspects of Jack's case in a paper he'd submitted to the Territorial Medical Journal, but he'd found himself struggling to explain the psychological and spiritual elements that had defined the experience. "How do you scientifically analyze a friendship that transcends species?" he'd written. "How do you measure the therapeutic value of loyalty that asks for nothing in return?" The silver pocket watch that Jack had given to Timothy had become the boy's most treasured possession, its steady ticking a constant reminder of the lessons he'd learned during those extraordinary days at the cabin. Timothy had taken to winding the watch each morning while sitting beside the Panther at Jack's grave, the ritual marking the beginning of each new day with a moment of reflection and remembrance. As the seasons changed and the first anniversary of Jack's death approached, the Panther's behavior began to evolve in subtle ways. While it still maintained its vigil at the grave, the great cat had also begun to explore the wider wilderness, sometimes disappearing for days at a time before returning to resume its guardian duties. These absences spoke of the animal's need to balance its loyalty to Jack's memory with its nature as a creature of the wild. Sarah had observed these changes with the understanding of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of grief and healing. "He's not abandoning Jack," she'd explained to Timothy during one of the Panther's longer absences. "He's learning to carry Jack's memory with him wherever he goes, instead of being chained to this one place by sorrow." The transformation of Cedar Ridge itself had been equally remarkable. The town that had once depended on Jack's protection had discovered its own strength during the crisis at his cabin, and the bonds forged during that violent night had created a sense of community that persisted long after the immediate danger had passed. People who had barely spoken to each other before the confrontation now worked together on community projects and supported each other through difficult times. Billy Garrett had been elected as the town's first official sheriff, a position he'd accepted with the understanding that he was following in Jack's footsteps as protector of the innocent. "I'll never be the gunfighter Jack was," he'd told the town council, "but I can try to live up to his example of putting the community's safety before my own." The cabin where Jack had spent his final days had been preserved exactly as it was during his last week of life, maintained by Sarah and a rotating group of volunteers who saw it as a sacred responsibility. Visitors from across the country had begun making pilgrimages to see the place where such an extraordinary friendship had played out, and many left their own small offerings beside the stone memorial. Father Santos had established a tradition of holding special services at the gravesite on significant occasions, blessing the continued bond between the Panther and the community that had adopted it as a symbol of loyalty and devotion. "This creature has taught us that love transcends the boundaries we create," he would say during these ceremonies. It shows us that God's grace works through all his creations, not just those made in his image. The stone memorial itself had weathered its first year beautifully, the granite holding its shape and clarity despite exposure to mountain storms and seasonal temperature changes. But it was the small personal touches that visitors added, the flowers, stones, and carved figures that accumulated around its base, that truly brought the monument to life. Timothy's promise to preserve and share Jack's story had evolved into something approaching a sacred mission. Now 13 years old, and showing signs of the man he would become, the boy had begun writing down everything he remembered about those remarkable days, creating a detailed account that captured not just the events, but the emotions and meanings that had defined the experience. I want people 100 years from now to understand what really happened here, Timothy had explained to Sarah as he worked on his manuscript. I want them to know that sometimes the most important stories are about ordinary people who discover they're capable of extraordinary things. The Panther's eventual return to the wild had been gradual and graceful, a slow withdrawal that honored both its loyalty to Jack and its need to live according to its nature. The great cat's final visit to the grave had occurred on a crisp autumn morning 2 years after Jack's death, when the aspen trees surrounding the cemetery had turned golden and the air carried the promise of winter. Timothy had been present for that last vigil, sitting quietly beside the stone memorial as the Panther paid its final respects to the man who had saved its life and defined its understanding of love. The great cat had remained motionless for nearly an hour, its golden eyes fixed on the granite marker, as if memorizing every detail of the inscription and carved image. When the Panther finally rose to leave, it had approached Timothy with the same gentle dignity it had always shown the boy. For a long moment, man-child and wild creature had regarded each other with mutual respect and understanding. Then the Panther had touched its massive head to Timothy's shoulder in a gesture that seemed to transfer the responsibility for Jack's memory from the guardian animal to the boy who would carry the story into the future. The great cat had disappeared into the wilderness that morning, but its legacy lived on in the changed lives of everyone who had witnessed its devotion. The stone memorial stood as a permanent reminder that love and loyalty could transcend every boundary that normally separated different forms of life, and that sometimes the most profound friendships developed between the most unlikely companions. Jack Roughneck Dalton had died as he had lived protecting others and standing firm in the face of danger. But his true victory lay not in the gunfight that ended his life, but in the relationships he had forged and the community he had helped create. The Panther that had once been a helpless cub had grown into a magnificent guardian whose loyalty had transformed a dying gunfighter's final days into a testament to the power of love to conquer fear, loneliness, and even death itself. The stone memorial would endure for generations, a silent witness to the truth that kindness, once given, creates bonds that time cannot break and death cannot sever. In the end, Jack Dalton's greatest gunfight had been against the cynicism and isolation that threatened to consume his soul, and his victory had been measured not in the enemies he had defeated, but in the friends who had chosen to stand with him when his last battle finally came.